As we said last time, we're going to look at the Great Divorce here. It's on the screen behind me as well, that version. And I took it at this point on the course. I would like you to know all the works at the same time before I come to them. I know that's not possible, but it helps to have in your mind various other works by Lewis, but I put them in this particular order, the Great Divorce following the last battle, because in the last battle we had a vision of heaven there of sorts as they entered through the stable door. We found that there were some interesting characters there. And one group of characters I didn't say much about at last class because I ran out of time. And that was the Dwarfs. If you remember, the Dwarfs were for the Dwarfs. And they weren't going to get taken in and fooled again by the political machinations of the others there. They were tired of listening to the people, and they were going to think for themselves and act in their own self-interest. And one of the things that's interesting about the Dwarfs is their worldview, if you will. They're intensely materialistic and reductionistic in their way of looking at things. It fits in with some of the themes that we've seen already. In terms of education, its tendency towards reductionism. And one thing I've not yet mentioned, I did mention the fact-value distinction of David Hume, that he said that we could know facts because we could verify them with our own senses, so test the scientific method, whereas values cannot be tested in the same way. There's an element of subjectivity in that, and for that reason, when we talk about predicates of value, such as beautiful or sublime or pretty, for them these are, taste is a subjective thing. It's a relative thing, and the same thing will hold true of predications of goodness or ugliness. So moral judgments will fall under the same sway, and Christianity will not only suffer the problem of metaphysics, the idea that we can't verify metaphysical things, it will also suffer from the attack on moral judgments. And that's what Lewis was trying to defend in The Abolition of Man, namely the Tao. He's trying to show that there is a consensus amongst all the major religions of the world on matters of moral judgment. They don't say the same things, but they are in the same ballpark. And he's confirming what Paul writes in Romans 1. And he sees modern education as moving intensely away from that. So I talked about Hume, but I didn't talk about Lessing. There's a writer, German writer in the early to mid-18th century by the name of Gotthold Lessing, who is famous for something that subsequently gets called Lessing's ditch. And he argues that there's a ditch between history and eternal truths that cannot be breached, cannot be crossed. So revelation in history for Lessing is simply not possible. Historical truth can't be demonstrated. It can't be repeated, and therefore it can't be demonstrated according to the methodology of science. And he also draws a distinction between accidental truths in history on the one hand and the necessary truths of reason. Reason doesn't change. And it's not historically contingent. 2 + 2 is always 4. It's logical, it's demonstrable, it's unchanging. It's not culturally relative. When Lessing says this, he's not facing our day where people will argue that 2 + 2 isn't necessarily 4, or that it's white math or some sort of craziness. But he promotes a distinction that the only universally acceptable mode of understanding the world is through pure reason. And Immanuel Kant builds on that, his critique of pure reason, etc. But this is a sort of a reductionism and an empiricism that is of great interest to Lewis. He writes about it, thinks about it as a student of philosophy, and later a student of literature, but it's a challenge for himself. And the Dwarfs are doing something like this. They're saying that they're reductionists in the way that they look at the world. They reduce everything to things that they can see in front of them, and if they can't see it, then they are going to dispute that it's there at all. They can't see it, they won't accept it, and they refuse to be persuaded otherwise. Nothing will persuade them because they've been fooled already. And in some ways, the Dwarfs are a bit like the Great Knock, which I suspect Professor Davis has talked about in his work on Lewis and apologetics. So a rationalist who appears in Lewis's fiction in various places, but is going to dispute the idea of the supernatural, which Lewis is establishing in Miracles, which many of you are reading as well. And miracles, as Lewis argues, is at the center of the Christian faith. If you deny miracles, then you deny Christianity any purchase in your life. You can't do that. You have to appeal to certain things that cannot be rationally verified by means of the scientific method. And the Dwarfs seem to represent that. Now, and he will talk about this again, I'll deal with this next semester, in that hideous strength. If you're with me then, when we go to sci-fi, Lewis's sci-fi, we'll talk about how this appears in that hideous strength. But here in the Great Divorce, we have something along the lines of those figures in that work corresponding to the ghosts in this work. So we get dwarfs on the other hand, and on the one hand, and the ghosts on the other. And that's really interesting here to me. And so he's dealing with a type of education, a type of epistemology, a type of worldview, if you will, for lack of a better term. And so that's why I left off there and started here. We had there the dwarfs, now we have the ghosts. As far as the title goes, The Great Divorce, he's leaning in a different direction, and he's drawing upon different sources. Today I want to talk primarily about the sources, the inspirations, the background to The Great Divorce. And next class, because I have two, I'll get into what happens and the specifics of the characters and the interactions there. But I want to give the sort of an overview here of The Great Divorce. The first thing is the title. And the title, as Lewis helpfully notes, so that we can't deny it, no biographer can reject this, he mentions that his inspiration for this is Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If I've written of their divorce, this is not because I think myself a fit antagonist for so great a genius, nor even because I feel at all sure that I know what he meant, but in some sense or other, the attempt to make that marriage is perennial. That good and evil are, in some sense, not opposites, but contiguous. They're shades of the same palette of gray. He'll talk about this in Book 2 of Mere Christianity. We'll come to that soon enough. And he will talk about the theological position. It's called pantheism, in which good and evil are not real things. That depends on your perspective, whether something you call something good or evil. A soldier who kills his enemy, we call him good. A cancer that kills somebody, we call it evil. Depends on your perspective there. It's not an absolute. There's no right and wrong on that. And he attributes that to pantheism as a view of reality which he rejects. And he rejects it here. as well. And he writes it, rejects it consistently. And so Blake's attempted marriage of the two, Lewis thinks, is just fundamentally erroneous. These two are, as far as is possibly imaginable, distinct. And he is at pains to try and establish why that is and in what way they are opposite one another. So it begins with that as a nod at Blake's work. Blake is a Romantic author, by the way. The Romantic period is prone to pantheism and reductionism, reduction to nature, which is often, in some senses, divinized, as is the human spirit, which becomes then the creative imagination. I won't get into that here. That's for a course on the Romantics, and it'll take me too far afield to get into that today. But that's how he begins. But he begins with those things in mind, but he has other sources and inspirations in the background that I want to draw to your attention today. And the first one, and for me the most important one, and one I have not seen other writers pick up on. I'm sure somebody somewhere has seen this, but I haven't seen them mention it. And it is one that he mentions right in this work, which I had you read, but I didn't lecture on, I don't think, in The Discarded Image, the first part. In the Selected Materials from the Classical Period, Chapter 3. I didn't lecture on it, but I said I'd post a lecture that I'd done in past years. I will still throw that up. I've not yet done it, but you could find it there. And it is something called the Somnium Scipionis, the dream of Scipio. Now, since I know that nobody has read The Dream of Scipio here, when I say I know it, I don't know it because I haven't asked you, but I'm pretty sure you haven't read The Dream of Scipio. It's a portion of Cicero's book called De Republica, which is following, it's a Roman response to Plato's Republic. In Greek, it's called a polis, but it's translated into English as the Republic. It's interesting because that's a Latin term for a Greek concept, and there's a difference between a polis and a republic. But this Somnium Scipionis is the sixth and final book from De Republica, and a lot of it is missing, but it's hugely influential. This work in the medieval period. Lewis mentions it here as a seminal work of the classical period, the Somnium Scipionis. Now, it is based, let me say something about the Republic. I don't know if everyone's read the Republic or just bits of the Republic, probably bits in my class, but in Book 10 of the Republic, it ends with a dream of sorts, a myth, the myth of E-R, right at the end. Which is recording a near-death experience. And that's how he concludes the book. It's interesting. Plato's Republic concludes with a sort of a myth and a dream of a near-death experience, talking about the afterlife. Whereas in Scipio's, the dream of Scipio, it's a dream sequence of a disembodied soul and where it goes. And where it goes is up to heaven. And what does it encounter when it gets to heaven? Well, I'll read some of Lewis's work here from the Somnium Scipionis, as I say, the discarded image. Scipio begins by telling us that during the evening which preceded his dream, he had been talking about his adoptive grandfather, Scipio Africanus Major. That, he says, is doubtless why he appeared to me in my dream, for our dreams are commonly begotten by our recent waking thoughts. This little attempt to give plausibility to a fictitious dream by offering psychological causes is imitated in the dream poetry of the Middle Ages. Thus, Chaucer, in the proem to the Book of the Duchess, reads of lovers parted by death before he dreams of them, In the Parliament of Fowls, he reads the Somnium Scipionis itself and suggests that this may be why he dreamt of Scipio. I'll skip over some of the other pedigrees that he talks about here, but one of the things that he goes on to say about this is that he pushes in the dream towards heaven, because the disembodied soul goes to heaven. And as it goes to heaven, it encounters the cosmos, as we've already seen it presented in the Ptolemaic cosmology. Remember I talked about the concentric spheres? That is based on this dream, and particularly a rendering of that dream by a Neoplatonist. But he goes up and he looks down on Carthage, because Scipio Africanus is a hero of the war between Rome and Carthage. It's called the Punic Wars. And he looks down on Carthage, quote, from a high place full of stars, shining and splendid, and sees Rome itself, and Rome at this point is an insignificant part of the earth. It won't be later, but it is at this point. And then he looks up to the universe, Scipio Aemilianus here, it's a different figure, and he sees the 9 celestial spheres. And the earth is at the innermost part of it, whereas the highest is heaven. Let me put that back up. Just so. Good as any. And at the utmost, that is at the outermost circle, which contains all the rest and is itself the supreme God. That's the vision of Scipio, or in Scipio's dream. That's what he sees. He sees heaven up there, and the sphere is God. Cicero is a Stoic. He posits divinity to nature in some ways. And then below that sees the 7 spheres of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., from lowest to highest. And he hears a music. And what is the music he hears? It's a universal music. I'll get too far off topic if I start talking about music here. But it's the music of the spheres. I mentioned that music was one of the 4 arts of the quadrivium. And one of the reasons that it's interesting from a contemporary perspective is how people notice how music has an effect on people's souls. For the ancients, they placed a bigger, greater stock in music and its importance than we do even. They think it's as important as arithmetic and geometry and astronomy, and thinks that those 4 are different ways of expressing the same thing. But there are 3 different types of music. This threefold division is made by Boethius in his treatise on music in the 6th century. He talks about the music of the spheres, yes, the musica universalis, but he also talks about a musica mundanus. What's that? Well, that's the scale, which we can hear. There's a frequency to it, and it's an exact mathematically precise frequency between each of the musical notes. And that has effect on the human being, who can also hear these things and can be tuned in accordance with the harmony outside of himself. So there's a sort of a concord between the human being, the instrument, who can produce the music as well. You can sing a song, you can hear the notes, the actual scale which we hear on the earth, and then its correspondence to the music of the sphere. So there are correspondences going on all around us. People think that music is insignificant. It's just there for entertainment. It's not so. Plato says that actually if you change a nation's music, you destroy its culture. Very interesting. If you want to destroy a culture, you change its music. Because he connects it with truth. It's not just a subjective thing. It has an objective correlation to the human being, for instance, who perceives harmony and now perceives discord. But I'm getting away from the Somnium Scipionis here a little bit. But this music of the spheres, he explains to his grandson, is because the spheres are, or rather the planets are set apart at fixed intervals, and they make an inaudible sound, which we can't hear. That's the music of the spheres. But what we can hear is the earthly correspondence. We can hear that, and it corresponds exactly to that. And that's why it's mathematically precise, and it is math. These days you can mark it in terms of hertz, the distance, H-E-R-Z, a certain number of gigahertz. And this dream is picked up by an author, as I say, a Platonist by the name of Macrobius. Commentary upon Scipio's dream is known throughout the medieval period, and particularly known by Boethius, whom I just mentioned. Boethius, who writes a treatise on music that's used all the way into the 19th century, as a textbook, by the way. All the way to the 19th century, a book written in the 6th century. That's a good long run for a textbook. Boethius is famous for a consolation of philosophy, regularly cited in the Middle Ages as an authority. We think of Boethius dealing with the problem of suffering and so forth. He's a very important Christian who's thrown into prison. But it's a primer sort of on cosmology, which influences Ptolemy. So he presents this dream sequence. You say, so what? It's known by authors who, this is the bridge now. This work, The Great Divorce, is a dream sequence. It might not appear so, but it is so. Lewis has forerunners. There are works here that are of great influence on Lewis's writing. Some of whom you know already, but let me recount them just a little bit. One of them you know as Virgil. Virgil, who's going down to the underworld, where we're talking about it going to heaven and hell. What are the precedents for going down into the underworld? Well, Homer's one, but of more significance for the medieval period, and Lewis is a medievalist, is Virgil. So Aeneas goes down into the underworld and arises out of it, as you know. More importantly to Lewis is the man whom Virgil most strongly influenced, Dante. You know about that. I see it's not dropping. That's okay. So we'll just do it this way. The conclusion of Dante's, I'll see if I can put it up top. I don't know if I can. No, I'm going to get rid of this. So I want the Italian there because I just like the Italian. These are the last lines of the Comedia, the Divine Comedy. I'll say more about that in a second. It's when he has gone down through the Inferno, out the other side, up Mount Purgatory, and then ascends through the constellations. You can see that. This is a picture of Mr. Dante on the inside of Il Duomo, the famous cathedral in the center of Florence, Italy. Italy's most famous citizen. He's a Florentine, but his language becomes the Italian language. At that point, it's just a dialect. There's all sorts of different dialects in Italy. This becomes the Italian. They choose Dante because his work is so beautiful and important. But this is inside its famous cathedral, a painting. And the painting is of the Divine Comedy. And in the Divine Comedy, showing here, he shows all three, or rather the fresco, he shows all three of the canticles of Dante. He shows the Inferno here, the Purgatorio here, and the Paradiso over here. And you'll notice above him are these circles. Or it looks like part of a circle, and that's the cosmology in the background up above him. Oops, there it is. Right? And at the end of this, now I need to go back to, where was it? There. So I searched the strange sight. I wished to see the way in which our human effigy suited the circle, and found place in it. And my own wings were far too weak for that. But then my mind was struck by light that flashed, and with this light received what it had asked. Here force failed my high fantasy, but my desire and will were moved already, like a wheel revolving uniformly, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Now keep that in your head. Well, you don't have to, it's on the screen here. The conclusion of the Great Divorce the eastern side of every tree trunk grew bright, shadows deepened. All the time there had been bird noises, trillings, chatterings, and the like, but now suddenly the full chorus was poured from every branch, the music. Cocks were crowing, there was music of hounds and horns. Above all this, 10,000 tongues of men and woodland angels in the wood itself sang. It comes, they sang. Sleepers awake, it comes, it comes, it comes. One dreadful glance over my shoulder I essayed, not long enough to see, or did I see, the rim of the sunrise that shoots time dead with golden arrows and puts to flight all phantasmal shapes. Screaming, I buried my face in the fold of my teacher's robe. The morning, I cried. I am caught by the morning, and I am a ghost. But it was too late. The light, like solid blocks, intolerable of edge and weight, came thundering upon my head. Next moment, the folds of my teacher's garment were the only folds of the old ink-stained cloth on my study table, which I had pulled down with me as I fell from my chair. The blocks of light were the only books, which I had pulled off with it. Falling about my head, I awoke in a cold room, hunched on the floor beside a black and empty grate, the clock striking 3, and the siren howling overhead. That's the end of the book. He awakes from his dream. The whole thing is a dream sequence. I have not seen this in any critic, but it probably is. I just haven't read enough of the critics, but I don't see the recognition that this is in fact a dream sequence. And following in the cosmological template laid down by Scipio, the Somnium Scipio, Scipionus, from Cicero, based on Plato's Dream of Error, and following Dante as it's being picked up. And it's dreaming what about heaven. So that is the general contours of the work. Very important, I think, for all sorts of reasons. But there's a cosmology here. The cosmology is very important to Lewis. He places it in his science fiction. It's very important there, the Dream of Scipio. And it's obviously there in Narnia. As I say, that Michael Ward, whom I've cited in Planet Narnia, he talks about it. But he's talking there about Narnia. He doesn't really get into the Great Divorce. I'm making the connection here. Maybe I need to write something on this, but I have no time to write. This is why this is my public scholarship. I put lectures on the internet. Somebody else is going to write it down. I won't get any credit, but there you go. The world will be a better place for it. So as I said, Lewis is very interested and finds it very important to not only present these terms with reference to past works, although they are there, and it's part of my job as a lecturer to draw your attention to the background material that Lewis has in his sort of mental furniture and is bringing into view there. So there is Dante, there's Virgil, there's Cicero, and then there's all the connections with that. That's there. It begins with Blake, but then it applies also to contemporary education. And this is where I think it becomes very interesting, because Lewis is always an apologist. He's not just a fictional writer who's using his sources and mixing them. There's a purpose to this, and it's a contemporary purpose. It's trying to teach something. He's not just, what am I going to write next, and what sources can I cobble together in an inventive way? He is trying to refurbish a traditional Neoplatonic vision of a cosmic hierarchy throughout his work, I think. Based on, I just mentioned, Macrobius. And one of the sources and the things that he's critical of is the positivism of writers in the late 19th century. Who are these writers? Henri Bergson, Friedrich Nietzsche, Wilhelm Dilthey. I'll expand on this next semester when we get to the science fiction, where he particularly mentions, I'm not sure if he mentions by name, but he mentions Bergson's notion of élan vital, or a life force. In the second book, Paralandra, he talks about a vitality. And the vitality is a sort of a spiritual power within the material. That's Bergson's idea. Bergson is trying to combat reductionism as well. It's not just a machine that we encounter. Human beings are not just machines, as Descartes presented them. Neither is the universe just a machine. There's life there. And we need to show reverence for life. And Bergson tries to attack the positivism of his contemporaries by establishing this vitality that's inherent in matter. And so he gets nods of appreciation from others for this. So there's a realm of organic life that transcends the merely material. And so he seems like a spiritual writer, and he is in that sense. And he's attractive to Lewis as well, I think. But he's not sufficient, because there is no sense of metaphysical for him. There's no heaven. It's just there is vitality within matter. And so he collapses the natural and the supernatural, and he sees the supernatural in the natural, and in a way a lot like the Romantic poets, like Wordsworth does, like Coleridge does. I think Coleridge tries to push against it. I'm not sure he's entirely successful, but he tries to recognize that we can't just talk about nature and the supernatural in nature. There has to be a separation. We can't just reduce God to a life force immanent in the material. That's just a sort of Darwinism, nature religion. So Lewis regards evolution as a great myth, very powerful. He finds it quite beautiful in some ways, but he thinks that it's, and as a scientific hypothesis, it's worth considering. But he thinks that it's insufficient to explain what Christians hold to be true. And that will be that there must be something that is above this, in the same way that, where is it? Here. the the musica universalis is up there outside of this, and there's a correspondence to it in the sense that Plato establishes. There's a purposiveness to the natural universe, and it points outside of itself. It doesn't just point to itself. We're not to reverence nature or the power within nature. And so Lewis, along with other famous writers of the period, and I can cite Tolkien, the Catholic intellectual Jacques Maritain, and others of their generation, there's a sort of a pushback against Bergson. They like Bergson, but they don't think that the two-plane reality that he presents is sufficient. There has to be a third plane. There's a mechanical, that is just a purely material, which even Lessing recognized. There is an organic or a vital component to life. That's the vegetable idea of growth and all that that's in there. But there's also a supernatural or a theological realm. And the most important of the three is the third, because it informs the lower ones. The higher informs the lower, not the other way around. We don't start from the lowest forms and work our way up to the highest. We start with the highest and work our way down to the lowest. Being, that's how being works. I'll say more about that later on, and a work that he read by the name of Flatland, which I forgot to bring as well. I left it at home. I have it. It's a novel written in 1884. And everything there is two-dimensional, where Lewis's cosmos is three-dimensional, if not four-dimensional. I'll talk more about that, I think, next semester when we get to Paralandra and the weirdness that's going on in Paralandra. It's really strange and hard to figure out what he's talking about towards the end. When he gets to the top of something like Mount Purgatory, the earthly paradise, he gets a vision, and time, space seem to be moving in all sorts of different directions that he can't imagine. I think he's talking about a way of looking at things. But he wants to lift the mind up to see things from the vantage point of heaven. And that's how he presents this. So the reason for the excursion here. That's why he writes The Great Divorce as he does. Is to show how the lower is actually dependent on the higher and not the other way around. The real reality is the heavenly reality. It's not, as Lessing and the scientists would have it, it's the material reality that we can look at and touch and measure and gain power over. That's not the real reality. The real reality is the reality of heaven. And it's so solid and real that when they go to heaven for a trip, as it were, heaven is so hard that they can't bear to step on it. And it's so heavy that they can't pick it up, not even a leaf. It's so heavy. And it seems to me that Lewis is pushing back a little bit against Dante here, because Dante's sense in the Paradiso is that heaven, though a place of light, is also a place of immaterial essence. It's almost like the underworld in Virgil, that sense. Now, it's whether Dante intends it or not, and I don't think he does, but there is a sense in the Western imagination that heaven is an ethereal place, a spiritual realm, and it is less solid and real than the underworld. I mean, the underworld, as you go further and further down and deeper into the inferno, it gets harder and more solid and more real, just like the ice. Right? So the most substantial thing in the whole cosmos then is the bottom of the pit of hell. And then when you leave and go up Mount Purgatory and then go up into the celestial spheres, further up and further in, you get into the realm of insubstantiality, like shades, except they're light, but non-essential. That's not what Dante intends, but that's the Western imagination. has the idea of heaven as an insubstantial place, like where ghosts live and fly around. Lewis pushes back against that very hard in this work. And he bases it, it seems to me, on a biblical understanding of God and his holiness. God is represented as being holy. And one of the words for holy there that is used in Hebrew is chavod. I don't know how to write it, but it's heavy, it's solid, it's real, it's substantial. Did you know that the heaviest substance in the whole of our solar system is the center of the sun? It's what makes it, everything else revolve around it, because it's so heavy. What's it made out of? What's the sun made of? Do you know? What chemical? What? Or what? Rather, what? Well, it's mostly hydrogen and helium, which is the first element in the periodic table, the lightest of all things. We get light from it, but it's the lightest of all the elements in the periodic table. And that's what the sun is made of. So how much pressure does there need to be on that substance for it to be that heavy? For everything in the whole cosmos, however heavy, to revolve around it. So think about that. And it emits a light that illumines all things. Now, the sun is a metaphor for God, but understand it's a metaphor. It's not sun worship. Christians aren't sun worshipers, but there's a sense that light bears a correspondence to God in the sense that things revolve around him. And that he is solid and real, and heaven, where he is a place of such utter reality that everything by comparison is unreal, insubstantial. Scripture calls it vanity in Ecclesiastes, chevel. It's like a puff of wind. All of human life is like grass. The wind blows upon it and it's gone. And the flowers of the field. Human life, human nature, it's there for a time and then it's gone. And it's remembered no more. But God is everlasting. Solid, real, etc. That's what Lewis is pushing at in The Great Divorce. Is this imaginative association of heaven with a less real, less satisfying, and less important place than our worldly loves and concerns. And just like Dante, it's all orientated in terms of love. So I've talked about this. I said I wanted to do these in order, or I wanted you to know all of them all at once, and nothing I can do about this. I wish I'd pulled the four loves to the beginning of the course, but then every time I think about doing that, I think, but you need to know this as well. But I talked about the four types of love. The familiar love, storge, the love of friendship, philia, the love of your opposite, eros, sexual love. And then the fourth, the greatest of all of these things, which is agape love, or charity, not like the rest. So the first three loves are earthly loves. They're things that merit our affection. We love things in our family because they're part of us in some ways. And that includes the cat whom you love. But also your favorite chair, your favorite, like there's a place. It can be, even things can be a part of familiar love, familiarity. Even horrible things can still be familiar, and there's a sort of an attachment. We would talk about an attachment. That's a form of love. Friendship, that's more of a choice. You choose who your friends are. And the people you choose to be friends are the people that look in the same direction as you do. You stand shoulder to shoulder with them. You don't look at them, you look forward. But it's a form of love. Your friends are of enormous value. The ancient world values friendship above all other loves to some degree. Then comes eros. Eros, you look at the one that you love Friends, you don't look at them really. You don't care what they look like even. They do what you do. You might notice their appearance, but really that's not why you're with them. Or they're not really your friends. If they wear the same clothes that you do, and that's the reason why you're friends, that's that's strange motivations there. But the erotic love is the love of the other, and you do look at the face of the other. And you love them because they're lovable. They're attractive. They're fun, they're enjoyable, they're delightful. There's something lovable in them. Agape love, the fourth, is not like the rest. It loves its nature is to love the unlovable. There's no merit in the object. And that's the love that God bears towards us. And so what Lewis is going to do in this is flip the script, as it were, the idea that our love is like God's love. And that by going up the chain, we get to the greatest love of all, which is the love of God. The greatest love of all is the love of God, but it's not to be understood from the bottom up, it's to be understood from the top down. Because it's not like the other loves. You can't go up and say, okay, on the basis of I love familiar things, of my friends, of my beloved wife, husband, whatever, I can now talk about the greatest love, which is the love of God. But no, you're comparing things that are fundamentally unlike. We call them love, yes, but that's because the love of God transforms the three other types of love. It's not because the other three are pictures of what God's love for us is like, because again, the three earthly loves are loves for things that are lovable, whereas God's love for us is the opposite. He loves the unlovable. So we can't go up and draw analogies on the basis of experience. And so Lessing's ditch leads us astray when we're thinking about God. First of all, there's no object as such, material object, but secondly, our understanding of love is not an appropriate analogy. So Lewis is going to put it the other way around and acquaint us with a heaven, which is a place that people in hell don't want to be. They find it thoroughly unappealing, unattractive. There's nothing that recommends that they hate heaven when they're there. And as an apologist, he's addressing one of the objections to heaven, which is that, why would I want to be there? I'm going to go and I'm going to sing choruses all day long and nothing else. It's not, I don't like that. There's nothing that is, that I think about in church which makes me want to be in church for the rest of my life. There are some people who like that. But some people say, can this please end? Because it's not. And so when I hear, well, this is great, we had a great time of worship, and we're going to be able to do this forever in heaven, just like this, and I'm thinking, is that really it? I have to endure this forever? And I think the answer is no, that's not what it's like. We're drawing analogies on the basis of the musica mondana, rather than the other way around. It's got to be from the top down. So you need a new vision and a different way of looking at it. And that's what he's doing in The Great Divorce. He's looking at it against expectations on the basis of his understanding of how love works, that is God's love, the agape love, as opposed to our human loves. And he's using, as a backdrop, Dante's Comedia. Now let me say something about the Comedia. Dante's an interesting character because he goes on a journey, nel mezzo del, what is it? On the middle of life's journey, I lost myself in a dark forest. And encounters somebody who will lead him on his path. The person who will lead him is none other than Virgil. Lewis is going to have somebody who will lead him on his path. His name is George MacDonald. Fantastes. Lewis regards him as a sort of a spiritual leader for him. Very influential. He cites MacDonald repeatedly. When you read MacDonald, it's hard to see why he's so important to Lewis. He's not nearly as interesting as Lewis is. But again, he's talking about his influence as a child and how it informed him. But he is here in it, and he is a sort of a Virgil to Lewis's Dante. So again, the analogy with the Divine Comedy is there. What is not there is this is not an epic. But he picks up some of the things from Dante. And one of them is that he has a guide. Not from the beginning, but he meets him there. He's not going to go up purgatory. He's not going to go into heaven. He's at the outer, in fact, he never goes further in or further up. He stays at the outskirts of heaven. He just gets a glimpse of it, and then he wakes up from his dream. Right? But it concludes, as I said from reading the end of The Great Divorce, a lot of sounds, and the sounds are singing. And the singing is accompanied by a blinding flash of light, at which point he returns to his senses, and there he is in his room, and he's pulled the tablecloth over his head, and the books have fallen on him, and the light that he thought was solid and hit him were books, and he probably had too many beers, and it just sort of collapsed there. But that was unnecessary comment on my part. No sense that he's had too many drinks. He is having a dream. But as far as the Comedia, the Divine Comedy, as it's called, is an epic, but it's written and it's called the Comedia. Why the Comedia? Two reasons, I think. One is because it concludes well with a beatific vision, with a vision of Christ, or of the Trinity and light. And there's a very optimistic sense of eschatology here, that the future is going to be better and not worse. It's not going to be Ragnarok, as in Norse mythology. It's not going to come down in a destructive ruin with everything being destroyed. It will be glorious when heaven is revealed. But the second is it's a Comedia. It's meant for the common people. Comedia has no connotations of common. But in comedies, the primary protagonists are common people. This is work for everybody. Dante's, as well as Lewis's. It's not written for a spiritual elite. If you looked at the Somnium Scipionis, it's for it's going up into heaven, and the people that go up to heaven are the aristocrats and the kings. They're the ones that go to heaven, and they become part of the constellations. That's not Dante's view, and it's not Lewis's view. Common people go to heaven. And he is one of those common people, just like Dante is just a pilgrim. He's just a pilgrim. I'm going on the journey of all our life's journey. That's what I am in the middle of. It's not just for the elect. That isn't the elite. It's for everyone. Comments or questions on what I've said thus far? I threw a lot at you, but I wanted to give you something of a prelude here. Obviously, when he starts and uses Dante as a template, he's not talking about Florentine Italy. He doesn't have the terza rima. It's nothing like Dante in certain ways. It's not written in cantos. It's not written in poetry. It's not. The timeline is not Good Friday to Easter Sunday. So he's not trying to. It's not a response to Dante per se. It's more of a response to Blake, and with a particular, the idea that heaven and hell are basically, or could be in some sense, married. That's not possible. So it has a contemporary application, but he's using medieval ideas to inform it. And so he begins not in Florentine Italy, but in an urban slum. And the people who want to make a journey to heaven leave on a bus. Very modern touch. In Dante's work, the souls have to ascend Mount Purgatory after years of penitential suffering for their sins, and the 7 P's on their foreheads slowly disappear as they ascend the 7 steps of Mount Purgatory. The P's gradually disappear from their forehead. P for peccatum, sin. A P goes away, and then the P goes away, and now it's, when all the sin is purged from them, then they can go up into Paradiso. Lewis has no objections per se to purgatory. He makes that clear in his work, but there's no purgatory here. And as I say, in Dante, at the end of the Divine Comedy, Dante goes all the way up into the presence of God himself. Lewis just sees the outskirts of heaven. That's all he gets to see. But there are some parallels there. I'll talk more about the actors there next time. Anything else that you want me to touch upon from here? Okay, well, let me say one other thing. I'm going to get to this towards the end of the course. I cited the little work, The Weight of Glory. It has a series of essays in it. They're all great. But the one that I want you to read and keep in mind, I mean, there's several of them, but the one that I think is particularly important for his creative endeavor, what he's trying to do when he writes fiction, is transposition. Might surprise you. Transposition. He wants to counter the tendency to see everything in terms of start from below and build to the top. That's the intellectual tendency. You start with the material and then you move up towards the spiritual. And the result of that is very predictable. The supernatural is reducible to the human. So religion is just a psychological desire. We wish that there was a God, because we need God. We feel like we need God, so therefore we create a God to make ourselves feel good. That's the opiate of the masses. That's Marx's reductionism, right? It's a psychological projection. And things where, and it cuts both ways, the things that are distinctively human. So the idea of reason and emotion and will. So the passions, remember when we talked about the abolition of man, I talked about the tripart nature of human nature and the reason. Animals don't have reason. Animals don't have emotions. They have sensation, but they don't actually get involved in weeping. And they don't laugh. And they have no free will. Animals don't have these things. These are creaturely attributes of human beings. Those things get reduced to an even lower natural level. They get reduced to, so love, which is the highest of human expressions, erotic love, think about all the love poetry written in every language, is reducible to lust. Reason is reduced to rationalizing. Volition is reduced to biochemical urges. Emotions are reduced to the same sort of biochemical initiatives. So you can treat people with emotional disorders with a pill. So everything has a form of psychological or social causation. So politics, which is a higher form of human organization, is reduced down to economics. And the reductionism keeps on going down all the way down to genetics then. Right? Reductionism. Lewis wants to combat the reductionism. And how does he do it? By means of transposition. So to reproduce higher level phenomena in a lower level medium. It's transposing. You know what it means in music. Transposing it from one key to a lower key. Remember, the key in which the celestial music is presented is inaudible. We can't hear that music. The highest correspondence to it is what? It's the highest note that the soprano can sing. That's the closest correspondence. We go up the scale, the musical scale, when we're singing the aria at the end, right? You get the soprano hitting the high note. Sounds celestial, if they're a good singer. If they're off, it's terrible. Nothing worth when it's off key, right? I can't do it, so I'm not going to criticize others that can't. But right, it sounds, and the choirs, when they want to sound celestial, the high notes are the ones that they approximate, because those are the ones that we associate with higher things, and in that sense it is. But again, those are approximations of a reality which is far greater and is inaudible. So what he wants to do is to counter the reductionism which he sees all around him, and the relegation of the higher things, like the conceptual things, the ideas, the emotional things, the loves, and the volitional things, to lower things. And to suggest that ideas are just epiphenomena. Epiphenomena. Projections. I think justice is a real thing, but actually it's just a chemical reaction I have internally that irritates me. There's no real injustice, there's no real justice. That's an abstract concept. It can be boiled down to a lower cause of the creaturely being, which a human being is just another sort of animal. All reductionism all over the place. So he wants to do what Bergson does in addressing positivism, but not by seeing the vitality, the life force in the creature as the solution. That's not good enough. It has to be higher than that. So the religious apologist needs to reason upwards from the natural to the supernatural, that is, to go further up, further in. Remember at the end of Narnia? But it has to do in a three-dimensional way. It has to have this concept of heaven that exists. And the heaven is not like the earth. So there's the challenge. Is to present heaven as a more substantial, more real, more true, and more human realm. So there's analogies going on here. There are natures piled upon natures. And he talks about this at various places in his work. Any comments or questions on this? I've just laid out a sort of a sketch of the main themes and the ideas that underlie it, the sources, some of the figures in it, and also the reason why he needs to do this. It's to combat the intellectual reductionism of his day. And if you can't do that, people are not going to follow you in thinking that the Christian faith is rational or desirable. And they're not going to want to be in heaven. They're not going to want to be with God, because God's portraits are often terrible. People's readings of Scripture are terrible also. They're not going to want to, they're going to want to be like John Lennon, say, imagine there's no heaven. You know, it's easy if you can. No hell below us and above us, only sky, right? Well, okay. So it's just a sky. It's not a heaven. Imagine there's no good and imagine there's no evil. It's just this world and we'll all live in peace. Kumbaya, whatever. Such crap. So it really is. So Lewis can criticize it in The Abolition of Man in a certain way. Here he does it in a far more, to my mind, powerful and persuasive way, through imagination. And he does it by flipping the idea of substantiality, reality, and delightfulness on its head. The earthlings that leave on the bus to go to heaven in a refrigerium, by the way, it's like a holiday. You can go to hell for one day, or go to heaven. And when they go to heaven, they receive it as a hell. Why? Because it doesn't give them what they really love. What they really love is back there. They don't want to be in heaven. So this is the final thing that the apologist has to confront, the idea that God's really nasty and he doesn't let people into heaven, and they're banging on the door, let me in, I didn't know I want in. Lewis challenges that by saying, here's the people, before they die, they go to heaven and they absolutely hate it. They don't want to be there. God gives them what they want. They want to be in hell. Their earthly dispositions are already inclining them that way. They only want what they can look down upon and make them feel big. They love those forms of loves, but they're not interested in the agape love of God. And if they're given it, they won't be able to cope with it and they won't desire it. They will want back as quickly as they can be. So Lewis is using the notion of love that he inherits from the Apostle Paul, from Scripture in general, the greatest love. You know, what's the greatest command? Love the Lord your God. And Augustine, as expressed even in our poet Dante. So love is motivating everything, including the people that go to heaven. They're motivated by love, but only the three first loves. They're not motivated by the agape love, and because of that, they don't want to be there. Whereas if they really loved their husband and their wife, they would realize that the reason they loved them is because there was a greater love that reminded them. It reminded them of. Just like Narnia, the reason we love the old Narnia is because it reminded us of this place, which they'd never seen. Went through a stable. You remember it talks about the stable, where there was once a being who made the whole world, yet in a little cradle. You couldn't see it. And the dwarfs, to go back to the dwarfs now, they can't even see that, and they're given delightful food. They put it in their mouths and they taste feces. Tastes terrible to them. They spit it out. Why are you giving us this stuff? So that the dwarfs are just like the ghosts that go here on the bus. They're in the midst of splendor, and all they see is squalor. And remember, they left a slum, which they thought was great. And now they're in heaven, and they think there's nothing here. This is the worst. I want to go back home right now. Very important. This is an important work for Lewis as well, I think. The Great Divorce. I'll get to this, the story next time and the specifics of it, and look at the characters in it, and just to give away a little hint, the characters on the school bus that Lewis confronts, when Dante goes to hell, we meet characters that he knew and he puts them in hell. Lewis doesn't do that. He puts actually versions of himself on the school bus. There's a poet there that's probably Lewis himself. He's a wannabe poet. I was once like this. There's a sort of a bishop there. Lewis, remember, with his mere Christianity, had pretensions about being the great Christian apologist and so forth, or he was the great Christian apologist, but then he thought he could be more popular by not talking about this salvation stuff all the time. Let's talk more broadly about things, and we'll appeal to a bigger audience. That's what the bishop desires. He doesn't want heaven, the bishop. Lewis himself was probably tempted in the same way. So I think they're variations of temptations that Lewis himself knew and is himself criticizing. And he gets slapped around a fair bit by George MacDonald, which is interesting as well. Probably, and says he probably I didn't want to say this back home, and he said, because they would have beat me, and then McDonald says, well, that probably would have been good for you. This is Lewis talking to himself and probably chuckling. Anyway, we'll get to that next time. I think I'm done for today. I've said enough. No questions? No, okay, we're good.